I know the title sounds absolutely mad, but stay with me. I'm not arguing that being fat is immoral. I'm almost arguing the exact opposite, because being fat is neither moral nor is it immoral. This is because fatness is a physical characteristic, not a moral property. So, describing somebody's body as morally good or morally bad is at best them being philosophically confused, or at worst, an emotional reaction disguised as rationality. Now, if you know me personally, you'll know I'm a pretty accomplished athlete within many different sports and disciplines. However, growing up in these environments, especially whilst being a teenager, I have noticed that many people, good gym goers and wannabe gym influencers, have had some rather impolite and inconsiderate things to say to those that are not in the best of shape. You've probably heard this rhetoric before. Being fat is lazy, being fat shows a lack of discipline, being fat is selfish, and being fat is morally wrong because it's unhealthy. This language never sat right with me. Not simply because it's rude, rudeness can still be correct after all, but it didn't sit right with me because the argument itself didn't appear philosophically coherent. This is because these people were not merely criticizing somebody's health, but they were quietly transforming a physical characteristic to a moral failing. They were moving from a claim about what somebody's body is, about what somebody's moral characteristics ought to be based on their body. And these two things are not the same claim. In fact, I would argue it's a category error. So, I hear you asking, what is a category error? Well, essentially, the name is on the tin. A category error is where somebody miscategorizes a thing, let's say. For example, if I'm sorting two animals into two piles, let's say lions and tigers, and I put a tiger into the lion pile, I've committed a category mistake. But philosophical category mistakes are normally more fundamental than this. For example, imagine somebody visits a university. Oxford, let's say. You show them the library, the lecture halls, the accommodation, the laboratory, and the students. And after this day of showing them around, they then ask you, yeah, but where's the actual university? The category mistake here is that the person is assuming that the university is actually a building itself, when in reality, the university encompasses all of those buildings. It is the organised institution constituted by the individual parts. Hence, the person has made a category mistake because they misunderstand what an actual university is. Something similar happens when people describe a physical characteristic as though itself was a moral property. Body fat primarily belongs to a descriptive category, as it concerns somebody's physical condition. And moral terms such as good, evil, virtuous, right, and wrong belong to an evaluative category. Hence, if you were to call somebody fat, that would be making a description about their body. Calling them immoral, on the other hand, is a judgment about their actions, or what type of person they are. Hence, you cannot simply just move from the first category to the second without an argument for why this is the case. This is because fatness does not contain laziness, selfishness, wickedness, or any moral descriptive property. So if you were to move from a descriptive category to a moral category, you have to introduce additional assumptions. And these assumptions, of course, need to be examined. The most common argument is usually something like this, and usually comes in a naturalistic form. People go, well, being overweight is unhealthy, people should not be unhealthy because being unhealthy is bad, therefore being overweight must be immoral. At first glance, this sort of seems reasonable to a certain extent, but this argument makes a massive and overstated logical jump. It begins with a really overstated descriptive claim of being overweight means you're unhealthy, and then it ends with a moral claim that being overweight must therefore be immoral. This is just a clear example of Hume's is-or gap. Hume noticed that philosophers usually begin by describing what the world is, before suddenly jumping and concluding this is how people ought to behave. You can tell me something's unhealthy. You can tell me that something risks illness. You can tell me something reduces somebody's physical abilities. But none of these facts by themselves prove that somebody is morally wrong. To make the initial argument work, you've got to introduce another premise, a moral maxim, let's say. Perhaps this would be something adjacent to every person has a duty to maximize their health. But why should we accept such a claim? Almost everybody does things deliberately which are bad for their health. People stay up too late, they drink alcohol, they sit down for too long, they consume ridiculous amounts of caffeine, they train through injuries, they spend their entire weekends getting worked up about football teams that don't even know they exist. So by the original argument, which is often provided by these gym influencer types, if being healthy is immoral, then we are all effectively sinners. We're all committing moral crimes on the daily. Hence, two things here. Their argument is either wrong or not rational, as they don't apply it consistently, which in my opinion it's both, because they're just incorrect. They don't know what they're talking about. This is particularly ironic as the same types of gym influencers that morally condemn people for being overweight more often than not are on substances like testosterone, peptides. They're taking absurd amounts of pre-workout and they're mixing it with their white monster. Those things are detrimental to their health, so they're not applying their argument consistently. This is because apparently, if unhealthy behavior produces abdomen muscles and bicep veins, then it suddenly becomes morally acceptable. In the face of this, these gym goers usually say, well, I'm disciplined and discipline's a virtue, so yeah, I've won. For that, I would say their argument fails for two reasons. First, you cannot read somebody's character simply by looking at their body. A thin person might be lazy and disciplined, even a muscular person. I mean, I'm sure we can think of plenty of people that don't contribute, don't do an awful lot in their day-to-day life, but feel over the moon because they hit one gym session a day. And vice versa, an overweight person might be a dedicated family person. They may care hard for their relatives, study difficult subjects, or succeed in areas completely unrelated to exercise. Someone's appearance isn't a complete moral autobiography, let's say. Second, even if somebody lacks discipline, it does not follow that they're immoral. Discipline is useful because it helps us achieve goals. But just because it helps us achieve goals does not mean it's inherently good. This is because a disciplined person may pursue horrific goals, and an undisciplined person can still be kind, generous, and benevolent. Hence, a highly disciplined bully is not morally superior to their undisciplined but kind counterpart. The bully's not better merely because he wakes up at 5 a.m., drinks his Red Bull, and cracks on with what he needs to do. This is because discipline is a tool, not good within itself. At some point, people abandon the naturalistic argument and turn to what resembles an intuitionist maxim. They'll be like, well, I can't explain why being fat is wrong, but being fat just feels wrong. Therefore, it has to be, which of course resembles moral intuitionism. Moral intuitionists argue that moral truths can be recognized via intuition. So we simply perceive that cruelty is wrong, torture is wrong, and that justice and kindness are good. But one problem with this is people have conflicting intuitions. One person might intuit that being obese is morally shameful, whilst another might intuit that body weight is morally neutral, whilst another might condemn the initial person and say that their judgment of a person's body is itself cruel, hence it would be immoral. But whose intuition is correct? Some people might argue that whoever's intuition is stronger is the correct one, but just because I can shout something really loud does not mean that I'm correct. Human beings throughout history have held all sorts of intuitions that have eventually been shown to be prejudice, cultural norms, or simply stupidity. So an intuition may tell us how somebody is experiencing something, but it does not automatically reveal a moral fact. Saying I feel strongly that this thing is wrong isn't exactly an argument. It's a subjective confession. Now, this brings us to one of my favourite philosophers, Mackie. Mackie was a moral error theorist. This essentially means that he believes that there are no moral facts, but we still talk about them as though they are true. This makes his position quite weird, as he is a moral anti-realist, but a cognitivist. This is because he believes that ordinary language attempts to describe moral facts, but that no such facts actually exist. This is because when somebody says being fat is morally wrong, they're speaking as though the moral quality of wrongness is actually attached to the fatness. This is Mackie's ontological claim. This is because he's saying that the quality of wrongness doesn't actually exist out there. To explain this, I'll attempt to illustrate it using, I believe it was Simon Blackburn's burning cats example. Now, this is quite a weird philosophical example, and if it's not actually credited to Blackburn, I apologise. But essentially, imagine you're burning a cat. Strange, but just stay with me. And I start burning this cat. I'm pouring the gasoline or whatever. I set it alight. And you, obviously being a normal person, go, well, that's wrong. But then I ask you to point to the wrongness. You know, you point at the burning tail. I go, well, that's not wrong. It's not the quality of wrongness. You're pointing to the burning tail. And, you know, we go through the rest of the cat's body parts until it's turned to dust. And even though you're attempting to describe something which is true or false, i.e., you're trying to describe the wrongness being true, you can't actually point to the wrongness. This is because the property does not exist. And this is why that Mackie argued that objective moral properties would be extremely strange, or queer, as he writes. This is because natural properties describe things, i.e., a rock might be heavy, a knife might be sharp, or a body might contain a certain fat percentage. But none of these physical properties have wrongness within them. As if fatness was objectively immoral, as these gym goers like to prescribe, where exactly does it exist? You know, what fat percentage does moral wrongness suddenly appear? Really strange if you really think about it and you're saying, well, that person's immoral because they're fat. You're essentially saying that there's some type of magical finger that comes out and points to the world and like, that's fat. You know, that it's just an absurd worldview. Now, this is where emotivism becomes useful. Emotivism, championed by Ayer, argues that moral statements do not describe objective moral facts. Instead, they express attitudes and emotions. However, these attitudes and emotions do not have any truth-apt meaning to them. This is because emotivism is an anti-realist and non-cognitivist ethical theory. This is because when I say something like burning cats is wrong, I'm not actually saying that it's wrong. I'm saying that I strongly disapprove of burning cats. Or quite humorously and simply, as the boo hooray theory of ethics states, I'm saying, boo, don't burn cats. So when the gym goer goes,
ew, being fat is immoral, it's bad,
they're going, boo, I don't like fat people. You know, I'm not a psychologist, nor am I particularly interested in psychology, but this could be caused by numerous reasons. They dislike the look of fatness, they find it unattractive, you know, they dislike the body positivity movement or whatever. Or simply, and what I think a lot of it comes down to is they were previously fat, they've now changed, but they're insecure of who they previously were, so they subject other people to moral judgment, so they essentially just become a bully. But anyway, AJR's theory reveals something very important, and it makes these, you know, pseudo-intellectuals seem a lot less intelligent and completely irrational, because their arguments at the start are not particularly strong, but I think they could convince some people. However, after what I believe, I've provided some good arguments against it and arguments that defeat it, we've essentially reduced their position to a strong dislike for some apparent reason, which, you know, only they know. So all their position tells us is nothing about the moral correctness or incorrectness of the person they're judging, but it just tells us about their internal state. So, when the wannabe gym influencer says fat people are immoral, they're not discovering any profound moral wrongness. They're emoting. I think it's pretty clear that my argument boils down to moral anti-realism. This is because moral anti-realists deny that any objective, mind-independent moral facts actually exist. So we can track people's health all we want, but we can't add any moral properties to it because these properties just don't exist. Returning to the title of this video, yeah, being fat is not moral. And it's not immoral either. It's simply a physical characteristic which for some reason people think that they want to moralize. You're not going to moralize the fact that I wear glasses or have a certain eye color. So why are we moralizing what body fat percentage somebody is? When somebody claims fatness is immoral, they've moved from an is to an ought, and they cannot justify this leap. When somebody claims being fat is intuitively wrong, they have mistaken their own reaction for knowledge. When all their pseudo-philosophy is stripped away, these wannabe gym influencers' statements simply reduce to emotion. And this expression of emotion is extremely infantile and irrational, as it essentially is,
Ooh, I don't like fatness. Ooh.
and when you put it like that, it's an extremely laughable position. You are free to value your health. You're free to value your own discipline. You're free to find people's bodies attractive or unattractive. We're allowed to have opinions. But the second you claim that your opinion exists as an objective moral property, you're no longer describing them. You're describing you. Thanks for watching.